Slide in front of you there. A very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining Linda and me for this session this morning. We're focusing on good governance in 2023, and obviously the subtitle is moving forward into 2024 as well. It's just not for a 3-month shelf life for this. And this is really all about what Linda and I believe effective governance in schools ought to look like at the tail end of 2023, moving into 24. If you don't know Linda and me, you haven't seen us before, those are our mug shots there, and you can see us in the flesh as well. And we've put a couple of email addresses, websites on there as well. Better Governor is part of Strictly Education, which is why my email address has got Strictly Education. But any questions you don't manage to ask this morning, you want to put to us, please feel free to do so. Sorry, hit the button too hard then, I do apologise. So in terms of what we want to cover in this session this morning, firstly, just to bring a little bit of clarity to our role and our responsibilities as people involved in governance. And when we say governance, we mean governance generally in all state-funded schools. So we're talking about academies and maintained schools and all phases of education, including special schools as well. We're going to be focusing particularly on what good practice, best practice actually looks like in governance, and are there some hints and tips that we can give you? Well, hopefully there are, that are some things that you might want to perhaps take on board as we approach 2024. We want to really think about how, as either governors or trustees, so in academy trusts or maintained schools, we make sure that that core purpose of governance, which is about having that strategic overview, how do we establish that? And that's really where we're coming from for most of this session this morning. So as Emma said, questions will be very, very welcome. Linda and I will do our level best to be able to respond to those as we go through the session. If we can't, we will actually come back to you individually after the session, because we have got some rather large numbers of you here, which is lovely, of course, but it does mean it's a little bit of a challenge actually fielding all the questions. Okay, so I want to start off really by thinking about, well, what does the law say? What are the regulations that actually determine for us as governors what we are supposed to do? And this is tied up in statutory regulations, and I think most of you will be familiar with the content of this next slide, even if you're not aware of where it comes from. It is regulations, and I've put the little tag at the bottom there to show you the source, but the responsibility of governing bodies, irrespective of their setting, is that they have vision, ethos, and strategic direction all clearly defined. That means, of course, we've actually got that sense of direction. We know where we're going. We have a vision that actually underpins everything that we do as a governing body. Governors are concerned about maintaining and strengthening the ethos of the school, and we have that roadmap of where we go from one year to the next in terms of our school development or school improvement plan, and actually those are key drivers for us as governors. The backbone of governance is, of course, accountability, and that middle bullet point there. Often these three strands are called core functions, and the middle one of those core functions is all about accountability. It's about us as governors holding head teachers to account for the performance of the school, and obviously indirectly for their own performance, but we'll say a little bit more about that later. And then the last one relates to our financial responsibilities, very much in the spotlight at the moment, and certainly an acute concern for an awful lot of us. And the responsibility for governors, as far as the legislation is concerned, says that we have to have sound, proper, and effective use of our school's financial resources. And we'll say a little bit more about that later. For me, I hope most of you will be familiar with the concept of elevator speeches. Phrase that Linda and I have used for many, many years now is that what that actually means, as far as elevator speech for governance, is what we do as governors, we ensure by seeking assurance. And I think for any of you who are new to governance, even those of you who have seasoned governors like Linda and me, then it's about thinking, do we spend most of our time as governors, because we believe that we should, seeking assurance that our schools are compliant with the statutory framework, are getting the best possible learning and the best possible care for all pupils within them. And we're going to explore that in a little bit more detail. When we say ensure by seeking assurance, what we're actually saying that As governors, we have a strategic role, therefore we're not running the school on an operational basis at all. We are ensuring that the school is doing all those things it should do. But of course, it's important for us in terms of having that accurate overview that as governors, what we should be trying to create, what we should be operating in, is what we refer to as a culture of no surprises. And hopefully most of you will actually identify with that, but of course there are certain key surprises which as governors we absolutely don't want to have. And it's important for us to think about the accountability strand in our role. And what we're doing here really is pulling the threads of that together and saying, because we are accountable for our schools as governors, we absolutely don't want surprises. We want to be able to connect all of the pieces of information, all of the monitoring, everything from school visits that we're engaged in, and pull those together so we're not in a position where we ever find ourselves saying, if somebody asks us how we know something, we don't say, with the greatest respect to head teachers, I know because the head teacher told me so. That's not an effective way of governing our schools. What head teachers tell us is absolutely invaluable, of course it is, but we need to be able to connect that with other pieces of monitoring evidence that show us that we've got a true and accurate picture of our schools.
And I think something I would just add there, Steve, one of the best characteristics that any governor can have is to be constantly curious, being curious, having that natural sense of curiosity, especially if you're a new governor. Why do we do it that way? What is likely to be the impact of that? It's all around that curiosity and that digging deeper, finding out a lot of things for yourself, but also ensuring that what you have found out, how you're interpreting it, is correct by seeking that assurance.
Yeah. And that seeking of assurance is, as we've said, absolutely the backbone of what we do. We should always be thinking, where is my assurance coming from? Am I secure in my knowledge of my school in all of the various aspects of that? Sorry. So in terms of the surprises that we don't want as governors, this is not an exhaustive list on this slide. It's not intended to be, but certainly these are the main areas, and we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail in a few moments. But certainly as a governing body, as I say, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about an academy situation or a maintained school situation, we don't want a surprise when we review pupil outcomes at the end of the year. We want to be informed as we go along. We don't want a big surprise when we review budget performance at the end of the fiscal year, whether that happens to be at the end of March in maintained schools or the end of August in academies. We want to know because we're informed along the journey. And similarly, when we're talking about head teacher performance management or appraisal, what we don't want is a big surprise in terms of the objectives not being met, etc. And of course, the biggest surprise of all that we don't want is when Ofsted come to call. We want affirmation from Ofsted. We want them to tell us hopefully what we already know, and we certainly don't want a big surprise with the outcome in terms of overall effectiveness. So on the next few slides, what we're going to do is unpick each of those in a little bit more detail, really just as little vignettes of what effective governance looks like. If you think about this no surprises culture, if you think about, well, what are those performance indicators, those key performance indicators that as governors, we've got to keep our fingers on the pulses of so that we are informed and we're putting ourselves into a situation where we are better informed, but also we're able to connect all that information that we're being given. And the first of those is the pupil outcomes element of no surprises. And here, all we're saying, of course, is it relies on a regular flow of information that does keep us informed. Because if we're to avoid surprises, then it does mean, of course, that we don't want to be thinking just about end of year outcomes. We want to look at that journey that pupils in our schools have. So we want to receive the outcomes of regular monitoring of teacher assessment. And there is quite a worrying, and I was doing some governor training last week, and somebody said to me, well, of course, we don't need to look at assessment anymore because Ofsted aren't interested in it. Nothing could be further from the truth, in my view, and I'm sure Linda would agree with me on that one. But the reality is, absolutely we do. Ofsted don't want to talk to schools about internal assessment. but they do want assurance it's done. Ofsted are more interested in saying to schools, okay, you've done your assessment, that's fine, I don't need to see it, but what are the messages that leaves with you? And therefore, it's imperative for school leaders, but also for us as governors, to make sure that we understand what those key messages are that come out of that data.
I
We
think
want
the
to.
first thing Sorry, Steve, the first thing to think about for me as a governor is, how does your school do it? You know, we're in different types of schools. How often is data collected? Because there are some issues that are linked to workload, and most schools have changed the number of times they collect this data, analyze the data. That once that's been collected and analyzed, it will be available for governors to look at. So we can do that seeking assurance. But what does it look like? In each of these bullet points, how is that done in our school or academy? And how, as a result of how it's done at that operational level, how can we as governors receive information that helps us to do that assurance process on that? Because it will be happening in every school at that operational level.
And that second bullet point is a really good example of that. What we want as governors, what we should have as governors, is assurance that the curriculum in our school is effective and fit for purpose. But as Linda says, are we judging that ourselves? No, I don't think we absolutely are. We want assurance there. But again, this isn't about knocking head teachers this morning, it really isn't. We don't just want the head teacher to tell us. What we want to do is to be able to look at the curriculum model and look at it and compare it to the outcomes we're getting, because the outcomes that we're getting in terms of pupil performance will be a very good reflection of the accuracy and the effectiveness of the curriculum. But we also want to think, as we do about everything, we connect all bits of information. The first session on the Governors for Schools conference today was all about inclusion. Do we think about inclusion for our curriculum? Do we think about inclusion when we're actually analysing those outcomes from teacher assessment? Because we should. We should be thinking about those different groups of pupils. We want assurance that the quality of teaching is good, because without good quality of teaching, we're not going to get those outcomes, and possibly the curriculum is not going to be as accurate. So there may be external verification, either from the trust itself, if you're operating a multi-academy trust, or possibly from the local authority in their monitoring role. But all of that is a good indication for us that there is good quality of teaching in the school, because those three elements do lead to effective outcomes, of course. That said, we ought to be thinking as governors, do we ever think about the outcomes and compare them with the predictions that we've been given? So it's a little bit early in the academic year at the moment, of course, in middle to tail end of September. But actually, the next half term, we should be expecting to get an update on where we believe we're going to end the year, whether that's in terms of GCSE or A-level results, whether it's in terms of end of key stage SATs, or even outcomes for individual year groups. As governors, we should know with a reasonable degree of certainty that this is where we believe we're going to end that year in terms of pupil performance. And of course, all the time, coming back to this idea of being able to connect the various sources of information we've got, we're connecting those pupil outcomes, how pupils have performed in tests, public examinations, or even just end of year assessments. We're comparing them with our monitoring activities that we're doing, and that includes us as governors visiting the school, of course. We're comparing them with connecting them rather with the appraisal process and the feedback we get on that from our head teachers, and how that actually links ultimately into recommendations for performance-related pay.
And the one thing I would add there, Steve, is when we're looking at the early part of this term, and we just had our first meeting yesterday in my school, we were looking at what had happened at the end of last year in terms of pupil outcomes. As those pupils now move on through the school, maybe entering a different key stage or a different cohort, thinking about what we knew about outcomes, what we knew about the other pieces of information in the head teacher's report, and how that then leads to what the school is doing as a result of those outcomes in this year's business plan or school development plan. So again, it is about connecting what has gone on in the past and some evaluative results, if you like, with what the school needs to do next, making those connections, particularly as governors, because that's what we're going to be monitoring over the next year.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, which is the budget outcomes. Again, as I say, very pertinent at the moment to quite a lot of us. We know that schools are struggling against a background of not very clever financial settlements at the moment, and therefore it's more important than ever that we do have regular monitoring of our financial reporting. Most of you will be familiar, might not be called this in all of your local authorities or your trust, but the financial monitoring report, or very often, I know somebody made the point in the last session about the acronyms, but the acronym FMR is something that we will very often hear. That means Financial Monitoring Report. In academies, it's a statutory requirement that the chair of the trust and the chair of the finance committee look at that, receive it on a monthly basis. Now, that's not just a box ticking exercise. The idea is that there is that close scrutiny of the finances of the trust. And there's no earthly reason, in fact, I would say it was actually very good practice for us to ensure that we do that in maintained schools as well. As I say, the worst surprise of all is that you get to February or March and suddenly realize that you're sitting on, potentially an in-year deficit, but worse still, a structural deficit. In other words, one that rolls over into future years, because then you're in the situation tantamount to having a big loan, and before you do anything else, you've got to pay your loan off. So that has a strangulation effect on the future operation of the school. And of course, linked to that, we should all of us have a 3-year or even a 5-year plan or projection now. But as governors, it's now become more important than ever that we actually seek the assurance from our head teachers, from our chief financial officers, our school business managers, whatever we call them in our settings, that that plan is actually fit for purpose. It's accurate, it's based on realistic assumptions and on information that is as accurate as it can be at this point in time. And of course, the biggest element of that is actually going to be our ability to forecast and predict our staffing needs and the associated cost with those. The single largest element of any school budget, which I'm sure you all already know, is of course going to be staffing. Many schools are in the situation now where the staffing budget accounts for upwards of 80% of the total available funding to the school. In some, it's above 90%. Now, that is not sustainable. It never was sustainable, but worse now because of pressure from elements such as energy costs and general inflation, that comes under even more pressure. So an awful lot of schools will find themselves in quite precarious situations and need to actually look very carefully at meeting pupils' needs through a staffing structure, but a staffing structure that is actually affordable. That's one element of risk. And of course, the idea that part of the role of governance now is about risk management is something that has been present in academy governance for quite some time and is slowly but surely creeping into the reality for those of us in maintained schools as well. And I think what we have to think about, and there's lots of elements to this, I've just put buildings, etc. in brackets there, just to remind us of the issues that some schools have got right now with the reinforced concrete, or RAAC as it's referred to. That's a huge issue. That's something that we probably none of us actually had on our risk register. But of course, it might be the most pertinent at the moment for some schools, but it's not the only one. The risk of actually running out of funding, the risk of losing some of your income that comes from lettings, charitable donations, etc. All of those are relevant for schools and things that as governors we should be considering. We've also got to think about, how do we compare with other schools? Do we engage in regular benchmarking? We should, as part of our overall assurance that school finances are being well led and managed, but lots of schools don't. It's something that is actually delegated perhaps to the school business manager or a chief financial officer. Actually, those systems, whether it's school's financial values standard in maintained schools, or whether it's a school resource management checklist in academies, they are governance tools, and they should be used by us as governance to actually give us that assurance that finances are being well led and managed, so that we're not going to get a nasty surprise there. And the other element of good planning, effective governance on this, of course, is knowing that if we are unfortunately going to be in a tricky situation with regard to future funding, we've already thought about how we would go about making economies. It's not nice, it's not palatable for governors, but sadly, it is one of our responsibilities and it's something we have to take very seriously. I see we've got a question on the panel from Harriet saying, how do we assess how good teaching is? So this goes back to the last slide. Is it solely results or is it colleague student opinions? I would say it is probably predominantly professional opinion of head teachers and senior leaders. Part of their role, Harriet, is that they constantly assess the quality of teaching. Part of that is due to the way in which the curriculum is followed, of course, but also how they are coaching, nurturing children and young people to achieve the outcomes that they want. Okay, and at that point, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk you through the next few slides.
Thank you, Steve. So first of all, let's have a look at head teacher appraisal. It kind of leads on quite nicely from what Steve was saying about how, as governors, we gain an understanding of the quality of teaching in our school. Of course, as Steve said earlier, we mix and make connections between different pieces of information that come into us. But overall, we're thinking about the performance of staff. There is a combination of things, both the expectations and standards we have of individuals, and then we have the support and the training that is offered in order to help progress their career and to support them in their practice throughout the year. Head teacher is no different to any other member of staff. However, the head teacher would be the leader in terms of everybody else in the school. So when we're thinking about appraising the head teacher, it starts off with the whole governing board, whether you're an academy or whether you are in a maintained school, the function is the same. It's not a one-off dip into appraisal. It's not an event that takes place once a year at a set time, although there will be something about us thinking about how we structure that. So as a governing board, we should know what the cycle looks like in our school, and we should have a role as a board in deciding who from our board is going to participate at a more operational level in that. And those individuals, and that might be you, certainly I've been involved for many years in different governing boards in this kind of activity. As a board, we monitor that cycle, that approach is taking place. And if it is you in terms of that operational part of that panel for the board, then you should take some responsibility about making sure you know what is involved, you understand the policies and the standards that sit behind that, and you know how your school or your academy structures head teacher appraisal, because for academies there's a little bit more flexibility about how they do that and how they engage with that external professional advice, because as governors we are not professionals. We aren't education specialists, so we do need some independent view, thinking back to the comments that Steve made about connecting pieces of information and making sure that we understand and are assured that the decisions that we're making are correct and balanced. So it should be monitored by the whole board. If circumstances change throughout the year, and we all had a big shock when we had the pandemic, but there are other types of circumstances that change, staffing, all sorts of financial changes that might drive some changes to the school development plan, which for most schools is a live document and is subject to making those changes. There is something about having a very good piece of professional advice about here in making sure that when head teachers' objectives are set, that they are measurable, and that governors understand how and when and with what information those measurements will be made. So if that isn't clear when circumstances change, then modifying those objectives, including the way in which we're going to measure how those objectives have been reached, is really important. So as governors, some of those naive questions around how will we measure success, what support is needed to ensure that our head teacher is able to carry out that task or that piece of work that we've set for them. And then connecting that appraisal with all those performance measures that we're very clear in our head, because as governors, we are going to, at the end of that cycle, make some of those decisions. So understand the cycle, understand how objectives are set, know what the measurements are, and if it's us doing that work, make sure we're trained and we understand the policies that are going to support that. Steve, you're desperate to come in with something.
Yeah, I think you read my face perfectly. We had a question on the panel from Alice, and Alice is saying, we have a link governor appointed for head teacher performance, but I haven't seen anything reported back to the full board. What should this look like? And is it done in front of the head teacher?
Oh, a link governor. Haven't come across that before, Steve, have you?
No, I haven't. I mean, I think I don't know what kind of school that you're in, Alice. If it's independent, then obviously you can have whatever arrangements you wish in place. But certainly in maintained schools, it is a statutory requirement. There are regulations going back to 2012 that actually dictate this, that there should be a panel of governors actually created to monitor the head teacher's performance and to conduct the appraisal. Academies have a little bit more latitude, but again, although it's not written in regulations, it's a condition of the funding agreement, and also Ofsted have a view that they will be wanting to ask governors in academies exactly the same question. So quite important that there's a panel approach to it.
And certainly I'm in a local academy, and there are 6 schools, and there is an involvement of the local board in this, which mirrors some of the maintained practice. It's not exactly the same. And there obviously is a role for the trust board and the trust as a whole in monitoring head teacher performance. So it's a shared function. So if you are in an academy, it's back to that, what is the cycle? How does it happen in our particular context? And then as a board, I'm not a fan of individual governors having total responsibility for anything, because it's a shared function. It's a corporate board. So you might be a link, but I think I'd want to unpick, what does being a link actually mean, and how do I interact with both halves, reporting back to my governing board and with whoever's doing the actual operational appraisal at another point. I'd want to understand that and make sure my board understood what that looked like and what my role was in giving that information in both directions.
I think we would also advocate that it is very good practice indeed for any governors who are involved in head teacher appraisal to ensure that they access training before they engage in that process. Some people will join the panel of a head teacher appraisal in a school because they're, oh, well, I've done appraisal, I've done performance management elsewhere. It's not the same. There are similar principles, of course, but it's not the same. And I think that whole concept of sharing with the rest of the governing body, there may be occasions, there won't always be, there may be occasions where it's not appropriate to share. The point is that the governing body delegates that responsibility to a panel of governors, and therefore any confidential elements of that shouldn't go beyond that panel, but the panel should be sharing with the governing body as a whole. Yes, we have undertaken our function, we've engaged an external advisor, etc.
And I would add there is that this is a part of our function as a governing body. If you remember when Steve started right at the beginning talking about pupil outcomes, and I chipped in with school improvement plan, there should be a connection between the objectives that are being set for the head teacher, which will flow down to objectives for other members of staff in the school. There should be that connection with the school development plan, because this is how it's all going to come together and ensure that as a function, the plan is delivered. So we should be able to see that there are some themes that are linked to the school improvement plan, and in reporting back to the governing board that the actual head teacher appraisal cycle is in place and is being worked through, that it accords with and is subject to some of those things that governors already understand from the plan that's in place. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about Ofsted. And I think this is often particularly for new governors or governors who have never been through an Ofsted inspection, something that kind of sits above them as a dark cloud. But it really shouldn't, because if we're operating in that culture of no surprises, then what we do as governing boards is in the interest of the pupils in our school. That's our advocacy, is we're advocates for all pupils, no matter where they have come from, no matter what their challenges are. We are advocates for them having the best opportunities at our school as possible. So if we remember that that is our role, then we don't do what we do because Ofsted are coming. We do what we're doing, and we're proud to say to Ofsted, we're doing a good job. We know our school because we're ready to be tested. We're doing this because we know and understand what our legal responsibilities are, how things are measured, and therefore knowing what the Ofsted framework is linked to. We're thinking about curriculum, how the learning that our children are subject to at school is designed to meet their needs. So that's back to our base role of advocacy. Knowing what that framework says, ensuring that what we put in place in school is compliant with that. Well, that's our compliance activities. That's that range of duties that hopefully most governing boards have some kind of work planner to ensure that they're compliant with different aspects at the times of the year that those things regularly occur. But we know where those things fall in that Ofsted framework, because they're just testing that we're doing the things that we are legally required to do. And then if we're confident that we are participating in governance at a sufficient depth, that we're curious, we understand, we ask questions, we've been provided with good quality information, we could have that conversation with either an Ofsted inspector or anyone else at sufficient depth to say, this is how I know what's happening in my school. I know because I did a monitoring visit. I know because I saw that in the head teacher's report. I know because we were a school that were chosen to have our writing results moderated by the local authority, and they accorded with the same information that I was provided with as a governor from the school. So it's about connecting that information. If we know that Ofsted is coming to our school in the next little while, and my school was Ofsteded earlier this year, then we can check that we understand what is required in terms of what that looks like when they might come. But it shouldn't be something that unduly worries us, because we should know our school and we should be confident in our governance. I don't know, Steve, if there's any questions around that, Ofsted, because I know it does worry some people.
Sorry, I'm muted. No, let me just, we've got quite a few questions here. Got one from Gideon on one other aspect of monitoring progress with SDP is the input through the year to the head teacher appraisal. Sorry, Gideon, it's a very long question. I'm just okay. I think it comes back, Linda, to this idea that we're asking how do we know what the right key performance indicators are? Because often there's a lag between what's happening and when it can be fed back to us as governors. So I think my view on that would be it's all about planning, and therefore effective governing bodies will actually make sure that they plan the dates of their meetings so that they either coincide or just fall after latest data collection. So whenever Ofsted come to our schools, if they're coming, or in fact just to ensure that as governors we know the latest position, we've actually got access to that data rather than having a meeting 2 weeks before the data drop.
Yeah, and that's something that in if you're looking at setting your dates for next year, and most governing boards, I think this is a fairly common approach, look at what their dates were last year, and if it worked last year in that kind of framework, they tend to set dates that look very similar for the following academic year. We always will check with our head teacher, does this fit in with our expected data drops? And it's exactly as you suggest, Steve. The information that might be in from the teachers then needs to be collated, analysed and put into a report. So there needs to be enough time between that, when that data is collected, and the governing board meeting for that to have happened. So we always double check with our head teacher that the dates that the clerk and I have said, yes, this seems to work in terms of our responsibilities. Does that work with you, head teacher, in terms of when you're planning to collect data next year? And then that can feed into that cycle of understanding. Okay, let's move on and just look at where we are in terms of what we've said so far. So we've talked a little bit about understanding what that strategic direction might be. We all have a vision for our school. We might not revisit that every year, but we should know what our vision, where our future is headed, how that drives our improvement generally, and what our values are that underpin that. That strategic direction then is informed each year, usually in the autumn term, by that school development plan, school improvement plan, school business plan. It doesn't matter what you call it, it's the same kind of document, but it sets out what the strategic priorities are for the year. So what are we working on this year? So if I give you a theme from ours, we had our meeting last night. We have, as a trust, we have a very strong focus this year on disadvantaged pupils, because the research shows us that if you get it right for disadvantaged pupils, all other pupils benefit. So one of the themes, one of our strategic priorities this year is around disadvantaged pupils. So again, you will be thinking, hopefully, as I've said that, well, what are the themes that are in our school development plan this year? There's usually 4 or 5 themes, and then those themes will have some detail, operational detail that will be added by your head teacher and senior team that will allow you to see how the school is going to deliver those themes. There'll be a connection to head teacher's appraisal. There'll be a connection to performance management of other staff, and also in how the staff are deployed, given that you've also got some financial responsibilities and limitations. That strategic plan then allows that focused monitoring to take place. And one of the conversations we had last night was, do we have the right linked governor roles on our board to adequately monitor that school plan over the year? So we had 5 themes. We then looked at individuals. We had one governor who has come to the end of their term of office. That's our safeguarding governor. We have to look at who's going to do that. That meant a governor moving into another position. And then when we then started to unpick how are those links, where do we need to change things around in order to add that disadvantaged focus? And we decided that disadvantaged focus would be across every link governor's role. And then we can start thinking, here's your school development plan. We have a spotlight in our plan for the autumn term. And so each governor, now clear about what their linked role is, can then start to make that arrangement to go in and do their first monitoring visit that will then come back and inform the governing body against what operational work and what the governor has seen. So there is a connection. And that is the idea of planning for no surprises, so that we're covering each of those areas.
And I think it's worth maybe saying there, Linda, that this question of what are we linked to as governors is something that Linda and I have given quite a lot of thought to over the last few years. Now, our view is very much that those links, as I say, it's not a coincidence. There are cogs on this this slide here. Everything here is interlinked, is connected, and the driver is always going to be the school development plan. So it makes perfect sense for governors to be linked to elements of the school development plan, as Linda's just said, rather than perhaps those rather more traditional, and I'm being polite in saying that, those rather more traditional links to individual subjects. And I think that's something that, despite the Ofsted lens being focused on curriculum at the moment, we are not intended to be curriculum experts as governors, and that's probably not a good use of our strategic time, I would suggest. So links for us, of course, to the important elements of school life, such as SEND and safeguarding, but then think about priorities in the school development plan, and that's where we should be focusing our efforts.
And remember what I said earlier about no one linked person. Just because you're linked with something doesn't mean to say the total responsibility rests there. You are the link between the operational delivery and the governing board. So information flowing in both directions. If you don't talk about somebody's monitoring report when they present it at the governing body, you are missing an opportunity to develop and deepen your own knowledge about that particular subject. And going back to the slide on Ofsted, We're not doing this because Ofsted's coming, but it does really help with those conversations if you have unpicked and thought about how that monitoring visit has informed you as a governor about a deeper part of that subject matter that you might not have been privy to in terms of your visit to the school. Okay, so let's just think about that on what we've just said. We're ensuring that the plans that we have as a school, our school business plan, is linked to achieving that vision. It takes us closer to that vision that we have of where we want to take our school and our pupils. We're ensuring that each governor's monitoring, whatever the visits, and I know some schools in the past have looked meeting by meeting, what do we need a visit for, given the subject matter we've discussed today. And if that works effectively for you, there isn't a one-way fits all to do this, but thinking, how is your monitoring planned to link to the school development plan, to make sure that you're testing that that's happening. And then importantly, monitoring what we value rather than, oh, we can measure that, so let's go in and do that, and then we can write a report, we can put some numbers in it, and we can tick that box. Really, we're looking here, if we think about that disadvantaged pupils as an example, what do we need to monitor to ensure that we are we're closing those gaps in performance for those pupils for whom the playing field is not level. So one of the areas, as an example of that, is that we have been looking at how disadvantaged pupils are able to access the clubs and extracurricular activities that we put on at school. And the research that the school did found that those pupils weren't often able to take advantage of clubs after school. So as a result of that, there are more clubs built in at lunchtime, and we're looking at whether some of those children now are accessing some of those opportunities. And these are really important parts of inclusion, that those children feel they have the same opportunities to do some of these lovely things that other children do as well. So that's a little bit more difficult to measure, but it is really important if we're going to make sure that we're giving those children every opportunity to succeed. Okay, so let's think about how some of those things that are current in 2023 are going to link in to what we need to do as a governing body. So what do we need to focus on for the remainder of this calendar year, but over the whole of this academic year, right the way through into 2024? So thinking that we have a clear understanding of what our school's vision is, and that we understand the way the school development plan has been structured, the objectives are linked back to our school performance last year and our vision, and reflect our own school context. So what are the things that drive us as a school, or that challenge us as a school this current year? So that area of disadvantage, deprivation, and it can cover a whole range of things. We're not only talking about individual families in a traditional way in which we did in the past. We're talking about families who, certainly in terms of the cost of living at the moment, are dropping into that category when we would never have traditionally thought of them as moving into that context. There's some families in work who are still suffering quite high levels of deprivation. In my own town, we have higher levels of drug trafficking. The county lines has exploded a little bit in our area, and we are seeing, some real issues there that we've had to think very carefully when we're starting to think about our more vulnerable children, our SEND children at the top end of primary, and from a safeguarding point of view. So you have to understand what your context is, where your school operates, the community it serves, the challenges that it has. And we pride ourselves as a school at knowing our families well. How could you be assured as a governing board that the same is happening in your school? What are your safeguarding risks? Is it around e-safety? Is it around some other context? Is it your school grounds and where it's located? Is it something else? So, you've got to personalize it and then ensure that your policies and your plans in school are meeting those additional risks or challenges. We have reputational risk, and that comes from all kinds of places. It can start with a rumour about a teacher not being replaced. And we've had to make in our school some difficult decisions about combining classes. We've had to do that very carefully because your reputation can get unpicked. And we're in a town of falling roles, and there are other places in other schools available. So it's about understanding and planning for mitigating the negative impact of any of these areas. So you do have to ask those questions, dig deeper. And often it's complex because you start with one strand and the financial part rears its head, the staffing difficulty in getting different teachers in different subjects, or different specialists, or working with smaller number of teaching assistants. All of these things link together and then make it a much more complex issue to unpick. And then on top of that, thinking about what are the key educational policies. We are a little bit devoid of new policies nationally, but thinking about what that Ofsted framework in 2019 and its emphasis on getting the learning offer correct for the pupils in our school, thinking about what those themes are and if we are actually compliant with those, and how some of those other drivers in the school context influences and supports learning for our pupils in each of those areas.
And I think, Linda, just to come in on that one, I think the reason for putting the word "and" themes there is because Linda's absolutely right. There isn't much in the way of policy initiative coming out of central government at the moment, but the themes that we probably all know about at the moment, such as attendance, we know attendance is a big issue in school. Linda and I, through Better Governor, have actually been doing a lot of work recently with our governors on how do governors effectively monitor attendance in 2023. And we did a session for governors for schools earlier in the year on that very subject as well. It's not going to go away. We've still got big legacy problems from the pandemic, and attendance is an issue in most schools at the moment. So that is absolutely an example of a key theme for us here, and we'd urge everybody to make sure that it's on their agenda and that we look at it in a perhaps far more forensic, more detailed way than perhaps we have in the past.
And we're going to come to that in a moment, attendance and some of those other themes, but let's just think about us as a board and our own thinking about what our plan for our board is this year. Do we have enough governors? Do we have the right structure? Many governors now are working in a flat structure. They don't have committees. And this was driven largely by the pandemic, although many boards were already working with a flat structure before that. But when we worked in a virtual way, we were a whole governing body dealing with all of the subject matter and maybe meeting slightly more often. So that flat structure versus committees, what's working for us? Do we need to change anything? Have we got enough governors? Is recruitment an issue? Are we back to fully face-to-face, or are we mixing some virtual or blended meetings? I'm not a great fan of the blended meetings, but we have two governors who are on maternity leave at the moment, and they welcome being involved by having the option to join us virtually. So I think we have to be flexible, certainly thinking about how in a modern world, individuals use their time effectively and trying to meet the needs of both sides of that, thinking in a more holistic way about making sure that we have active and effective participation. Clerking is a huge role now because they often provide that professional link to advice and regulatory guidance that is missing elsewhere on the governing board. So making sure you've got a clerk with the right job description able to do that role and make sure you are fully compliant with your responsibilities is really important. And again, there's financial challenge to that. And I know that isn't easy for every board to find. commitment to our own development. Are we undertaking training? Are we able to do a good job with the knowledge that we already have? And there's a whole range of training opportunities out there, virtual, working alongside other governors, working across a trust, but it's being committed to that, being curious enough to explore the options and undertake training, vital to ensure that we're doing the right things in order to be effective as governors. And then what are our must-haves in autumn 2023? Where should our focus as a board be? What sorts of things do we need to think about? So if we move on to that next slide, Steve already mentioned attendance. Making sure that even though our head teacher might have talked at depth in our last meeting about attendance, testing that again. How is our school doing in comparison to the national data? And they're publishing that data on a weekly basis so that we can keep up with those trends. What is happening with our different groups of vulnerable pupils? How are we operating with the spike in in-term holiday options? And are we using fining? We know that this is a focus for nationally to get attendance back up to those levels of expectation. And we are expecting new regulations that will deepen that. And also the practice in the last couple of years has been to share examples of good practice, so we know, as well as what our new requirements are, how some schools have managed to do that effectively. Thinking inclusion, suspensions and exclusion. There's new guidance. Suspensions, our role as governors comes to making sure that we have policies in place that support pupils effectively in managing their own behaviour. So we're talking about behaviour here, to the point at which we then use these regulations. So first of all, behaviour policies and attendance, then suspensions, how we use that, how effective it is, and then thinking about the exclusion guidance and making sure we're within the law of that. And I know there are some more offers tomorrow in a bit more detail about some of that subject matter. We've got some new keeping children safe in education. There are new expectations in there around the filtering and monitoring systems that we have in place in our school. Are we fully compliant? Are they effective? Thinking finance, with all of those difficulties, as Steve explained earlier, have we got a balanced budget? And what is our outlook for next year? And are we then thinking in terms of that structure of and the percentage of our funding that goes on different things? Are we thinking about what our pupil product's going to be coming in next year? We have falling roles in my area, so that's something that is quite worrying, against the increased cost of our staffing. And then thinking more widely about staffing, subject shortages, the supply of early careers framework teachers that are newly qualified teachers, if you like, and whether we can, what's the age profile of our staffing? Are we expecting people to move on in their careers? Have we lost staff? And do we understand the reasons why staff have moved on? Are there opportunities within our trust, if we're part of a wider family of schools, for staff to be grown and therefore retained because we've given them different opportunities? Do they feel well supported? And then thinking about our own succession planning as governors, do we have people who are willing to take on additional responsibilities? Do we have governors who are willing to look after the training side, look after the recruitment side of governors? Are we planning governors to become vice chairs? If we're a chair of governors, have we got other people that we're mentoring to become possibly the chair in the future? Because one of the worst things that you can do is when you put that out as a new chair, everybody looks at their feet, and we don't want to be in that position, because as the outgoing chair, we haven't done the groundwork to ensure that people are ready to take that extra responsibility. And I think we're on the next slide, Steve, at this point. But thinking about, in a wider way, about diversity, equality and inclusion. do we adequately, as governors, ensure that schools reflect this when we're looking at putting our agendas together? We're looking at the subject matter that we're talking about in school. Are we reflecting that wider inclusion and understanding of the very mixed range? I'm thinking of inclusion in the very deepest sense, from from children whose behaviour might be difficult, right the way to children who have a recognised characteristic or are suffering some chaos and disadvantage in their own lives, and a whole range of other things as well. Inclusion, diversity, equality is a very multifaceted subject. We're doing a good job with that. And then in terms of workload, staff workload, are we acting? Do we understand what the issues are in school? Do we have a staff wellbeing focus at operational level? Are we holding our head teacher to account for reduced workload wherever possible? I know we had a big project in our school around the reduction of marking, and how that works in a different way now to reduce that burden and focus more on the delivery of the curriculum. So I think those things are really important. I'm aware that we're probably very near the end of our time, and I'm conscious that I need to hand back to Emma in a moment. But Steve, have we got any questions that we haven't answered that you want to just address?
Well, I think there's lots of questions about the. I volunteered the visit template to a couple of people. I've done that on the thing, but Emma's just said that they will actually send it out. I'll send it to Emma. Everybody will get it. If you don't want it, folks, don't download it. Is the answer to that. But thanks for all those of you who've shown an interest. I think there's one question from Catherine Linda, which we'll just ask. Going back to the absence and attendance issue, does fining work in reducing absence?
I think the jury's out on that. It's the law. We've exhausted those other options, and we have to be sure as a school that we are not being generic in the way we deal with absence. It has to be individualised to the families and the circumstances. And your parent governors often will be good at reporting back about holidays in term time. When it is clear that everything else has been exhausted, then fining is the legal route, and the money does not go to the school, it goes to the local authority. So it isn't a way that schools are making sure they're getting more funding, because that simply doesn't work. But whether it actually works, sometimes the fines are insufficient to cover the shortfall in the holiday in a school holiday time, and parents will just take advantage of that and do that anyway. But we do have to think very carefully that we have applied everything that is within the school's power to try and make a difference.
And to be fair, I think holidays are probably one small element of the attendance issues that we have in school. There are a lot more which are perhaps ingrained attendance problems, pupils with mental health issues, etc., just general school refusers. And I think schools have to look at what strategies are putting in place. Fines really are there for, they're not there for holiday makers, but actually that's what tends to be the reality. We need to look at those deeper, more entrenched issues, such as persistence, absenteeism, and severe absence. Right, very sorry, folks. Just say thank you very much from Linda and me. We've thoroughly enjoyed your questions this morning. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen and pass you back to Emma now. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.